Beavemanites and Docutrons, assemble!
Okay, so back in the day, I was way above the wave, and I traded in the girls for the video games. I played so much Super Smash Bros. Other kids called me names. They called me.
All right, well, welcome Beavemanites and Docutrons. This is the Beaveman, and I am in Renegade Beaver Studios here in Michigan, where it's a beautiful fall day, and there's a ton of leaves out back, and I'm going to have to rake them, and that sucks. With me today is Skylar, my son, who is in Georgia, learning about film and stuff. Tell us about what we're doing there.
I live a little bit a ways from Atlanta now, so about half an hour to get there downtown, and it's just I'm attending the Georgia Film Academy to try out different things in film and see basically what I want to do in that area, and that's about it. I've signed up for some new classes, so that's pretty much the gist of it, though, just doing some training.
And for people who don't know, Atlanta's a big place where they do a lot of filming.
Yeah, they're filming pretty much everything Marvel here, and they're filming the Falcon and Winter Soldier TV show here right now.
Very cool. All right, so you and I have been talking about what this month specifically. Well, last month, I guess, really.
A lot about horror movies.
Yeah. And I think that that's at least for me, a lot of the horror movies that come out now are not scary.
No, they're mostly very formulaic. It feels like they're almost designed to give you just normal, kind of run-of-the-mill jump scares, pretty much. But they're not really scary.
No, so do you think that's because we can get scary movies so easily, or scary TV shows that they're not scary anymore? Or do you think we're getting desensitized, or do you think that they're still picking themes that are supposed to be scary but are not real world scary?
I think a lot of what it is they're picking things that aren't they might be scary in the real world, but the way that they do the application and specifically how they make the movies makes it not scary. I don't think it's desensitized. I think it's strictly the way that filmmaking in horror has changed, because horror, if you look back at how they used to make horror movies, like if you look at the Evil Dead franchise and how hard Sam Raimi had to work to make those movies, and most of it's practical. There's very little CGI in it with the way that he made it. But now if you compare that to something like the Conjuring movies with the doll Annabelle, that's like 99% CGI, so the filmmakers don't have to work very hard. It's mostly the special effects people. And special effects really, unless it's done very well, isn't scary.
Right. I think that probably a lot of it is from the older movies where you had special effects and really good makeup artists that were doing kind of, if they had to build something that was animatronic and then make it up, or if they had to make masks, etc. I think that actually makes everything scarier, because they have to work with how that person actually moves and how they do things. But now they're trying to mimic how we move with all the CGI stuff.
Right, and it's basically just putting people in green screen rooms or putting motion capture on them if there actually is a physical person replicating what these monsters are doing, which isn't usually the case. It's most of the time they're just making it up as however the filmmaker or whoever wants it to be, which, I don't know, it's a lot harder. Like when I watch horror movies, I can watch horror movies all the time because I know it's not real. But I think something versus watching a giant person I know is real running around in a mask fake killing people is a lot more different than watching this monster that I know is completely CGI running around and killing people.
Right. I think when they have to actually use people to make the characters, it's a lot better. If they actually have some good makeup artists, or if they've got some really good camera shots. I mean, because obviously you could crank out I watched a horror movie yesterday, and clearly they didn't have to spend very much money to make it, and they actually only had one scene that they shot at nighttime, so everything else was shot during the day, which I'm sure they did that from a practical sense. But they only took 18 days to shoot it. So, and they just had a creepy killer dude who was wearing a pig mask. It actually looked like a really skinned pig head, and that was a pretty decent idea, but you can tell it's when they do that, they don't have to spend money on CGI, they don't have to spend money on special effects, and they're just going from that kind of base layer, then they don't have to spend that much money, and you can crank out a decent horror movie. Like in the 60s and 70s, they cranked out a ton of horror movies.
Right. A lot of it, too, is that horror movies are now notorious in Hollywood for being very easy to produce and have a very large return, which is why there's kind of an oversaturation on those. A big part of it is just that studios will give probably, I say, on average, your typical horror movie today, just based on the ones that usually come out in the budgets I've seen, they'll give them anywhere from $10 to $15 million, which for a Hollywood movie is incredibly cheap. That's like pocket change. But their return could be $100 million or $250 million, which also in box office terms isn't the highest that we see, but spending $30 million after marketing versus getting $250 million back, they're obviously, you look at any of the franchises, there's like 8 sequels in those franchises are barely 10 years old. It's because they make so much money because they're so cheap.
Well, and the interesting thing too with the horror movies, I think, is that if they're a good horror movie, then you have to suspend disbelief a little bit.
Yeah.
The good horror movies that I can remember from like my teenage years, I guess, would be like the Freddy Krueger movies. The Nightmare on Elm Street. So Freddy Krueger's scary because he's coming to you in your dreams, but you can die in your sleep, and that he's killing you for real. So
right.
That's where you have to suspend disbelief, but there's a little bit of truth to that because it's, people may say that I died in my sleep, and like, when they dream about stuff, and like, well, really, I don't think that that's actually accurate because people generally, they don't die in their sleep. And it's always supposed that if you do die in your sleep, obviously those people die for real. So at least there's a little bit of psychological science there that goes a little bit along with it. But
right.
you suspend that disbelief that that could actually occur, and also if they're successful with that first movie, even if you kill the bad guy, they figure out some way to bring him back.
Right. That's a big horror trope, is that you'll watch a lot of these movies and there's always, you can tell that, quote unquote, it was meant to be the final film in the franchise because of the way that they kill off the character, the way that the story ends. But because it made so much money, it doesn't even have to be good. As long as it makes money, they will bring the character back for 3 or 4 more movies, which they've done with pretty much every character. Freddy Krueger's died so many times. Candyman has died pretty much every single movie. Jason has died an insane amount of times and gone to space. And yeah, I don't know. They certainly have their interesting ways to circumvent the characters dying.
Well, I think at least from the Freddy Krueger franchise, it makes sense that they can keep bringing him back because he was dead from the beginning. He was already dead in the first movie. So,
right.
Theoretically, like, well, if you can already believe that this dead character has come back as a villain, then it doesn't, how would you kill him off anyway and not... there's less likely for you to argue that you could bring him back. Whereas if the other characters are supposed to be, quote, actual people, and then for somehow they transcend after that, then it's different. So in your opinion, though, go ahead.
I don't know. There's a big disconnect between, a lot of it is also like studio politics, because I can't imagine, from people I've met, there's a big horror community that loves like the B horror movies, and they love like all the cheesy, whatever, gory stuff. So they're definitely not the mainstream audience though. So I know those people love getting like 8 of the same film over and over that are kind of repetitive, but I don't really know how mainstream audiences feel on the circumventing of the character death, because obviously they're not as invested in it as other people are.
No, I think that when you look at like the cult followings, the people they don't mind with it coming back. They don't mind with a lot of the gore and telling it's fake. And there's probably less movie magic and more makeup and more, where you can
Right.
have this unusual amount of blood coming out of somebody that's not even possible. I'm like, well, if we make 5 liters of blood and it's just pools and pools of blood coming out, you're like, okay, that's not realistic, but that's fun for people. Like Elvira used to have, I don't know, it was like Saturday nights, and she would host horror movies, and they were always movies like that with lots of blood and gore and stupid titles, and people really like those movies. Now
Yeah,
you don't
there's
really see
definitely
that
an
much.
audience. Yeah, there's definitely an audience, and I've met some people when I worked at when I was doing my warehouse stuff. One of the guys I worked with really closely, he was part of he knows pretty much like every B horror movie, like all that kind of stuff, and it's always fun and interesting to talk about them. But like, I'm probably not gonna sit down and watch them, because even though I like cult movies, there's still just some that are way so out of the range that I'm like, I don't know if I'll actually enjoy it.
Well, it's the same thing when you look at like the B movie type, the fantasy movies. It's kind of the same thing. There's some really good fantasy movies, and then there's completely off the wall, goofy ones that people really like. So
Yeah.
I think horror is pretty much the same. But if you're looking to really be scared, if people really want to be scared, I think there's a difference between those, what they call the B movies, and the mainstream or the big box office type movies, where people are supposed to be kind of psychologically scared.
Right.
But even now, like you said, it's easy to crank out a movie, apparently.
Yeah, because most horror movies, even when they're funded by big studios, or even like movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the original Halloween, they filmed those in about 20 days on average, and that's in the 70s and 60s is when they filmed those. So horror movies are usually, indie-wise, even in history, been notoriously short shoots, which is really a cheap way to do it, depending. So horror movies have always kind of had a lower budget and shorter shooting schedule. But now, whereas John Carpenter didn't have time to make Halloween for longer, or they didn't have more time to make Texas Chainsaw Massacre, now it's kind of a standard that these movies are shot that short, just because that's the way the studio will save money. So it's kind of becoming like the industry standard for that.
What do you think is a good formula for a horror movie? If you had to kind of break it down almost into, like, if you were putting an outline, what do you think or like a recipe, what do you think is the main components that you would shoot for a horror movie?
I think there's two different ones. I think the horror movies that entertain me are the slasher horror movies, so movies like Texas Chainsaw or Nightmare on Elm Street or Halloween. Those ones really entertain me. The ones that scare me are completely different, because those are movies like Hereditary or Midsummer, which are more psychological. Like, there are violent acts in them, but it's not about someone wielding a knife coming after you. It's more about breaking down people, who they are as characters until they're nothing, which I think is way more terrifying. So if I was to make a formula for a movie like Halloween or Friday the 13th, you need a very large, intimidating figure that it's somebody, their massive size alone is enough to scare you. And then you would have to pick an iconic weapon to give them that already isn't being used. Like Texas Chainsaw Massacre has the chainsaw, obviously. Michael Myers has the carpenter's knife, or whatever you call it. And Freddy Krueger has his finger knives. Jason has his machete. So you basically have to get a big enough character that can intimidate you just by looking at them, which, if you look at those actors are actually insanely tall and lumbering in real life. and then you basically just have to give them a weapon that hasn't been chosen yet, which I can't think of off the top of my head what one I would give a new character, just because the big ones have already been taken. But then you'd have to set it primarily at nighttime, because historically scary movies aren't that scary when they take place in the daytime, which Midsummer is the first one I've watched that's actually scary, because there is not as much night. The whole thing is set pretty much during the day. So you need a big character with a weapon that can do some pretty disgusting damage at nighttime, and you probably need at least 4 or 5 main characters that are either teenagers or in college. That's pretty much the slasher formula, which Scream does a really good job of parodying that.
Right.
But
Okay, well,
I
let's
think
look at the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, though, right? The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I just watched that a few days ago.
Yeah.
The original. I hate to say that it's not scary. It's
Right.
I mean, but it's not scary. But
No.
the thing that's cool about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the first kill in the movie is there's no provocation whatsoever. He baits the guy in and kills him for no reason. He just kills him. That sets the tone for the movie for me, because it's like, oh well, he doesn't have any reason to kill him. He's just killing him. Which
Which
that's
I
what
think
makes
is-
it scary.
Yeah, I would agree, because I was watching it the other night, and it kind of catches you off guard in the way that the one of the characters is just walking through the house and everything is normal and you know something's coming, but then it just happens completely unprovoked. And I think that's probably the only scary part of the movie for me, I would say, is that part where it just starts going, because the build up for it is kind of slow.
Right.
And then it takes off, which is really cool. But yeah, I think that it's gotten to a point where it could just be for me, but I've watched so many horror movies that those types of movies aren't really scary anymore. Like, they're entertaining to watch and I really enjoy them. But if I want to be scared, like, I went to go see The Lighthouse recently, which looked more of like the type of movie that would freak me out, just because the movies that break down the characters psychologically, I think, are quote unquote more realistic, which is why I think they're a little bit more scary for me. Because I know there are a lot of the horror movie characters are based on real people, but especially in today's society, there's not quite the terror that there was in like the 70s and 80s, I think. Which might mean that kind of horror movie is dated, and which is why they're shifting more. A lot of the horror movies you'll see are more ghost type right now, which is an interesting way for them to shift the genre a little bit. There's definitely more ghost movies coming out. But
See, in that respect, I don't find that scary. I think for me, so the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, he's scary because he's not provoked. He has no reason. He just does it.
right.
And he has the rest of his family that's doing, they're helping along. They're doing the same thing. So, and we have no idea why they're doing it in the first place. I've never seen like Texas, the second one or anything like that. And everybody thinks that it's, it's based on this real character, but it's loosely based on Ed Gein.
Very loosely, yeah.
Very loosely, but Ed Gein, you know, if you learn anything about his story, like if you listen to the last podcast guys tell his story and stuff, and I read about him on Wikipedia also, you actually feel really sorry for Ed Gein. He was just a sick individual.
Yeah, Ed Gein is a big one that's... Yeah, I mean, Ed Gein is a big one that his story is really tragic, and like same with Jeffrey Dahmer. There's a lot of characters based on his attributes too, but there are a lot of scary serial killers that like you shouldn't have any remorse for, but there's also a lot of ones that were just sick, and it seems like a lot of with the big popular characters, they pick the ones that were sick. So I'll go and read about them, and I'm like, well, I'm not scared. I'm more sorry for them.
Right. I mean, obviously what they did was horrible, but yeah, you can understand that. Like Ed Gein was, he was just a sad individual. He was a tragedy. But
Right.
when you look at like Ted Bundy, nobody should feel sorry for Ted Bundy.
No. But yeah, I mean, even Leatherface in the movie, if you watch more of his backstory, they get into it. But even just in the first original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they do a decent job at setting up that Leatherface is only doing what he's doing because of his situation and his family environment and all that. So obviously Leatherface has his own problems, but they kind of do that spin where, because of the whole reason he wears the mask, if you get into that psychology, it's because of the way his family treats him. And you're like, well, I'm not really sympathetic to Leatherface, but I can understand that he's still a sad character somewhat.
Yeah, I mean, he grows up in a house without any love, obviously.
Right.
And the same thing can be said of, like you said, Jeffrey Dahmer. You know, it's a sick story, but there is some empathy for Jeffrey Dahmer.
Right, because you can kind of see, unlike things with other serial killers like John Wayne Gacy or like Ted Bundy, like there are moments where you can see where they snapped, but those are a lot of out of anger, whereas like Jeffrey Dahmer and Ed Gein, you can tell that they were in pain and that's why they snapped, which I think is a lot more tragic.
So then you talked about like their selection of weapon also. For me,
Right.
I mean, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was scary before you get desensitized with everything else. But for me personally, I'm like, why would you pick a chainsaw? Unless you've got like a really good chainsaw that you're sure is gonna pull and start every time you pull it. That seems like a really ridiculous implement. But hey, I guess it made for a good movie.
Yeah. Well, there's parts where he uses like meat hooks and everything else, and I think those parts are scarier than the chainsaw parts. I think it's a lot more terrifying to see him skewer people on the meat hook than, fake hit them with the chainsaw in the back.
Yeah, and there's one scene. I mean, the original scene. I mean, when he first gets that guy, he bludgeons him with something. I'm like, now that was scary.
Yeah, because that just comes out of nowhere and it's one hit and it's over.
Right.
And you're like, well, what just happened? Yeah, I think that is effective, but you have to wonder, because it's kind of odd that there was a time before these movies where these things weren't iconic. So obviously the people who made Texas Chainsaw Massacre probably didn't think they were going to make an iconic horror movie. So and at that time, I know Halloween wasn't out, and Friday the 13th also wasn't out. So Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the really early iconic horror movies. So you have to, like, giving Leatherface the chainsaw was purely just a creative choice to give him the chainsaw, which is interesting to think about, because it's interesting to think about how these horror movies that invented so many things for the genre just threw them in there to do them, but then they eventually became staples of the entire thing.
Right. Yeah, well, I think that, like you said, though, they have to try to invent something different, because everything that you do now, like all the slasher, I think that all the slasher movies can trace their origins back to the big ones. So you can say, okay, well, we got to have somebody who's disfigured or looks disfigured, or like you said, somebody who's really big and maybe they carry something, or whatever that instrument happens to be. I think the one movie that I saw that did the same thing, made this shadowy figure that nobody knew what they were. They weren't disfigured, but they took something that nobody would think was really scary, but it actually made something kind of creepy. And I think that movie was I Know What You Did Last Summer. And it was,
oh yeah,
and the scary figure was wearing like he was like, had the fisherman's slicker and the hat, and he had like a hook. And
yeah,
that was actually kind of a scary take. You're like, well, they took something that you wouldn't normally think is scary. You're like, well, who's scared of a guy wearing a fisherman's slicker? But that ended up being kind of scary. And they actually did fairly well with that. They took the same formula again, a bunch of teenage kids, and they always like to throw they always have to like have some sort of a love interest in there, which I'm not sure is super necessary to the formula. I mean, if you take a look at like The Shining, there's no romantic anything in there, and that's one of the scariest movies. There's no romance going on there really in that whole thing.
Yeah, I think that when it comes down to, because horror movies now, they're so studio controlled for the most part. There's a lot of stuff, even with movies that aren't horror movies, Hollywood just likes to throw in, like, we need a love interest for this, we need a love interest for that. That doesn't necessarily, and you can tell when it's, like, not part of the original story, but you can tell they had to kind of put it in there. So I think that, especially when it comes to horror movies, they like to interject the relationships in there, but I think one that does it really well is Wes Craven did a really good job with the Scream franchise. And I think that kind of, it took a formula and parodied it, but not to the extent that it still wasn't a really great movie, which I think is really hard with how meta he was trying to be with that movie, that it still turned out to be, like, I would take it more seriously than I would take it jokingly, even though it does poke fun at the horror genre as a whole.
Right. But there's a twist in that one that most people don't see coming till you don't really see it coming.
Right.
Which I think that's part of what makes Scream a decent movie. That, and like you said, the parody part of it, where like, oh, you're not supposed to be alone, or you're not supposed to go, well, you should never take a shower, or whatever. Yeah,
explaining the rules. I think that's a good, interesting concept for it. Which then you branch it off because Scream kind of then inspires Scary Movie, which that I wouldn't call those. They have horror movie elements in them, but those are straight up parody, so I hesitate to call those horror movies.
Right, which is when you go to actually look for movies to watch, and of course everybody uses Netflix or Amazon or Hulu or whatever, but you'll notice when I've done searches for horror movies for the genre with Netflix and with Amazon, Scary Movie will come up in them.
Yeah, it will, and I'll see it pop up while I'm looking for other horror movies, and I'm like, I get what they're saying. I can get if people argue that they're horror movies just because of how based around horror movies they are, but I would put them more, I wouldn't put them in the horror genre. I'd put them in comedy.
Right. Well, the whole problem is this very broad categorization of movies in general or genres in general. For example,
Right.
Another one that I saw in there, and this was a movie that I don't remember what year it came out. It had to have been the early or mid 80s. Probably early 80s. And it's totally, I would say it is not a horror movie. I would say it is a superhero movie. And that was Swamp Thing. I'm like, Swamp Thing is not a horror movie. Swamp Thing is a good guy. And he's battling some bad guys. He's not, I'm like, I don't know how, and that just consistently becomes up as a horror movie. I'm like, it's not a horror movie.
Yeah, that's confusing because Swamp Thing is in there, and then Marvel has their own version of Swamp Thing, which is Man Thing, which that got a movie on the Sci-Fi Channel like years and years and years ago. But if you look at it, it's largely considered a horror movie,
Right.
which is kind of weird.
But to me, it's, well, I guess the genre would be what they call action adventure, I guess is what I would say it is, as opposed to being a horror movie. But maybe that's
Right.
just I guess that's just how they classify it. But again, if you look at some Alien movies are scarier than, so if you take Alien as example, Alien's a good example. Alien is one of the scariest movies, in my opinion. But I don't know if they classify that as horror or if they classify that as sci-fi.
I think that one is, I don't know, because I've seen people classify it as both, but in my head I would count it as sci-fi. But I know, because it's like it's the same thing with like Alien versus Predator. You look at those movies, like they're shot and composed very much like horror movies, but it's taking the Alien franchise and the Predator franchise, which is mostly sci-fi, like there are scary elements in them. But then when they get to like those versus movies, they kind of mash them up into full out horror movies, which is interesting.
Right. Well, yeah, because if you take Predator, the original Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger,
Yeah.
that's totally sci-fi. That's action, adventure, sci-fi / whatever.
Yeah.
If you take the original Alien movie, I would argue that, I would definitely say it's sci-fi, but it is one of the scariest movies. I would rank that as
Right.
one of the scariest. The original one is one of the scariest. I'd say it's still a horror movie both. Both, but you compare it to what's considered a scary movie. I'm like, that's not a scary movie compared to Alien.
Right. Yeah, I think that it's interesting how you can kind of bend the genre a little bit, which like another good example is like the first Cloverfield movie. That one I've seen as both sci-fi and horror. It gets displayed as a horror movie a lot, which I haven't seen the first one. I've seen all the ones after that, just because I don't know if I would like the handheld shaky cam the whole time.
Right.
But that's one I've also seen as like both a horror movie and a sci-fi movie, but that one I think largely people attribute to horror.
Well,
Which
from
is
a
kind of odd.
Okay, so let's say then from a filming standpoint, right? Or I guess you call that what, cinematography. From that standpoint, what are you mostly looking at when they talk about, for example, like negative space?
Right.
So when you're
So for horror movies, a lot of the horror movies that happen now will try to do like scares in the background. So when you're composing a shot, like a shot of scenery, you're supposed to take into account everything in the background of the frame, which if you're watching a movie, you're probably not going to notice any of that. Like, you're probably not going to notice the family photo randomly placed in the background of this character's home, but somebody had to put it there and somebody had to make sure it looked right, etc., etc. So a lot of the, like, when I think of it, what comes to mind is like the Conjuring movies, which is like those movies with like The Nun or Annabelle, like the doll and stuff. Those movies, a lot of them will have stuff happening in the background, like scares going on in the background or characters looming in the background that, like, if you're looking really hard, you'll see them, which is an interesting way to have things set up in your frame because obviously not everyone's going to see them. But as far as horror movies go, they're not notoriously shot very well. They're shot very standard. So a very standard movie is kind of a bland movie is what I would say is basically you set the camera up on a tripod, you set it towards whatever you want to shoot, and then you shoot it. And a lot of amateur movies are shot that way, which there's nothing wrong with shooting that way, but it gives the movie kind of like a very standard feel, which is why when you watch a movie that has like does interesting angles or does really interesting things that you don't see very often, it blows you away a lot more because a lot of movies are made the same exact way with not a lot of interesting frames or a lot of interesting shots in them. So movies like what Christopher Nolan does, where Christopher Nolan does these insane, crazy things with where he places the camera. That's why it usually gets so much attention because a lot of movies, especially horror movies, they'll just point the camera at whatever they're supposed to film, and then the camera will stay there and they film it and then they move on. But there's just so much variance in the genre because if you're making a horror movie, you either really, really like the genre or you just don't care at all. And I think that comes across in the filmmaking for those two.
Right. Okay, so you're kind of making an interesting point. So when you look at it from, say, like a psychological standpoint, why are scary movies scary? There's a couple things that go on. If you just place the camera and you're filming everything, then that actually, as a person who's viewing it in the audience while watching the movie, that's actually too much for you to take in at once, which causes you to be anxious.
Yeah. There's a split. You can either give a lot of negative space and have the character be far away in your frame, which will make feel like the world is really big, or the one that I think does a lot more is you can bring the camera insanely close to the actor and have there be no negative space so it feels like you're suffocating. That's the one I like a lot more because it still gives the feeling of loneliness and isolation, but now you can't escape what this character's going through versus as if you showed like one character on a street at night, you show the whole street. I feel like that gives a little too much hope that this character can go out into that wide world. But people, like if you watch a movie like Halloween, there's a lot of close-up shots, and there's not too many wide shots. So a lot of it is all centrally focused on the characters, and you get the sense that these characters are really important. But then when you see like Mike Myers, he's like pretty far away from everything in all these wide shots. So I think it makes it more effective when he gets to close-ups and he's right upon these characters. But if you watch a lot of movies today, a lot of that is either the person really likes horror and they'll try and do like interesting angles that will kind of creep you out because you're not used to seeing them, or they will just set up the camera and yell action and then it's just really static. So there's a good way usually to tell if they care about the movie they're making, just because of the way that they actually handle the camera and what they're trying to capture and how they're trying to capture it.
Well, for me now, I think that what they've done is with this, if they don't change it up, like you're saying, if they don't do different camera angles, then when they're doing these wide shots where, you know, your main character takes up part of the screen, but you still have a lot of screen left, I think what everybody's doing now is nobody's focusing on the main character anymore because they're like, oh, well, something's going to happen in this area
Right.
over here. And so now we're all trained to see that in the first place, and that takes away that fear factor. That takes it away because they're like, okay, this is going to happen. Prime example with, like you said, with, I can't remember which one of those many Conjuring movies, they do the same thing. You're like, oh, there's something's going to happen over here.
Yeah, because you can
It
tell.
did that, you know, where in the second It movie, and if I spoil this for anybody, I'm not really spoiling it.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. If you were going to see it, you were going to see it, and I'm not really ruining anything for you. But It did it also where, you know, the main character's talking with the old lady, and in the background you see her kind of, you know, shuffle by or run by
running around.
You're like, okay, well, something's going on over there. And they've trained us so much now that, yeah, you have to do a different angle. You've got to change it up in some way, or else unless you really want them to see that, you shouldn't want them to see it. You should want it to be a surprise, but everybody's looking for it.
Right. There's definitely, I think the way that audiences watch horror movies is also changing, because we've gone from an era where these slasher movies and these horror movies are so outrageous and pioneering a genre to where I'm going to go out with my friends at 10 o'clock. Let's go see whatever random bad horror movie is out. So I definitely think the way the audiences see it is now different too, where it's kind of more versus, I think it's more an audience back in the day would look at this and be like, it's so revolting and disgusting, like, I can only watch this movie, blah, 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 under such circumstances or under so many times. But, like, you talk to anybody, like, my age or a little bit older, or even, like, Summer's age, they'll just go watch these horror movies because they're out and they're fun, which is different.
Yeah. Well, I personally feel let down by the horror movies. And I don't know if that's a fault of my own or if it's a fault of the movie making. Because if I go to a horror movie, I want it to be engaging, and I want to be interested in the characters.
Right.
Sometimes, I mean, for me personally, now when I go see a horror movie, a lot of times now I'm like, you know what, kill that person. I don't care. Yeah.
Right. Well, I would agree, because I mean, it makes sense. Like when I went to go see the Halloween reboot last year, I knew it was going to be bad, but Halloween is one of my favorite movies of all time. So obviously when I came home and I was very upset, like I went to go see that movie because I wanted it to be at least somewhat good, but it seems a lot of them basically just kind of make a joke of the whole genre itself now.
Right. Well, even if you look at, so like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre again, okay, so the original one, when I'm watching that, I'm like, okay, well, you know, I kind of feel for these kids, but they're nosy, they're obnoxious, and I'm like,
Yeah,
do I really?
They didn't have to go over there.
Yeah, they didn't have to go to them. I'm like, why are you so nosy? Why are you walking in somebody's house? all those other things. And I'm like, okay, well, they've got the guy in the wheelchair. I'm like, well, he's obnoxious and annoying. I'm like, well, you didn't have to pick the guy up in the car. How idiot are
Yeah.
you? I'm just like, I mean, obviously they're not real characters. They don't deserve to die, but I wasn't invested in any of them. I was like, well, I don't really
Right.
care. I don't care if they die or not.
Well, I mean, I feel the same way too because the character in the wheelchair, I was watching the movie, I was like, this is one of the most annoying characters, and I can't wait till
Yeah.
he's off the screen.
That's what I was doing. I'm like, I want him to die.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think it's just the way that horror movies are so classically written is that a lot of the times their characters are so shallow just because they're there to be killed. So it's always refreshing when there's actually real thought written behind the characters.
Right.
Like when Wes Craven writes a character and they end up dying. Like there was most of the time there was weight behind that kill because you've been watching this character and learning about them for so long. Which I think is a lot better than just having a higher body count just to have a higher body count.
Right. I think that what they need to do is these horror movies just need to actually have someone that you can root for on, the protagonist side, because otherwise people are not invested. I'm like, I don't care. Even with
Right.
with the It movie, I'm like, yeah, I don't care if that kid dies.
Yeah. I think it's because they're trying. I don't know if they're doing it directly or indirectly, but they're making the antagonist, whatever villain in it, they're making them the hero.
Right.
Like if you watch a Jason movie, Jason is the protagonist of that movie, even though he's a villain. And you're like, well, that's not any fun because he's gonna win. Or if if he doesn't win, he's just gonna come back.
Right.
So-
And who are people dressing up for as Halloween? They're not dressing up as the victims.
Right.
They're going to dress up as, Jason or Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger, or being, the old ones. Or now,
Yeah.
what was the number one Halloween costume this year was Pennywise, I'm sure. So they had Pennywise baby costumes. You could dress your infant up as Pennywise.
Yeah, so they're turning the villains of the franchises into the heroes, which then, if you do that, obviously there's more character focus on the villain, but not as much character focus on the other characters in the movie. I think one that does it differently are the new It movies, because Pennywise, there's a lot of backstory there. Not as much backstory in the book, obviously, but you still get in the second movie, you still get like he's an alien or whatever. So there's still some development for his character, but they didn't let the children or the adult versions of them fall to the wayside, which usually they will just let it go and it's not really important. But I think with those movies, it was a little, I don't know, it was both refreshing and boring because the second movie, a lot of it is just them going on a scavenger hunt. So, I don't know. I think it's got its refreshing moments, but it also has its limits to where, okay, are we knowing too much about these characters or... But...
Well, my opinion of it in the first place is not good. I don't think it's scary, for one thing. I think that it was like any other... And I like Stephen King, but like anything else, he ruined it by making him a giant space spider. I would have rather had a demented demon clown. Or I think that once you add the... And I don't know if that means that I want it to be more realistic, but once you start adding in space spiders or you start adding in the supernatural, I would rather just have evil human nature. If base it on what just an evil human would do. That to me is scary. That to me is when you make it that somebody could actually do this to you. Not that the paranormal doesn't exist, but what's more likely to happen? More likely to happen that some sadistic a-hole out there is going to do something. That's more likely.
Right. That's what I would agree with because I think it's a lot scarier, like because I'm trying to get a storyline plotted out for my horror story I want to write. I think it's a lot scarier if, I don't want to say it's realistic, but if there's even like the slightest chance it could happen, or if it's just happening out of randomness, but it's still happening because someone real is doing it, I think it's a lot more scarier than this asteroid hit the Earth, and now because this asteroid hit the Earth and all these things lined up just so perfectly that now this chain of events will happen. But I think it's a lot better because, like, when you're watching Texas Chainsaw, that whole thing could have been avoided if they didn't go over and walk all over their house and look at all their property and look inside their windows.
Right, and it's just like the old joke. I can't remember which comedian always did, but they always make the comment that you're only going to see white kids. This happened to white kids, because if you were black, you're going to see the writing on the wall, and you're like, I'm not going in there. I'm not going in there, or I'm not going in that house, or I'm not going to go up there, and I'm not going to be caught in the middle of the woods. And the minute I walk into a house and the house says get out, I'm getting out.
Yeah, I don't really know. Obviously, because I was not raised in the 70s or 80s. I don't know if it was just a thing of the time to walk into other people's houses back then, but I don't know. I can concretely say that I would never just walk into someone else's house. I don't even walk into my friend's house until they invite me in. So
no, I mean, we had people that would come over and, like, they would open the door to our house, and I'm like, that seems like a really bad idea. And I don't know what generation ever decided that was a good idea, because, I mean, I know they talk a lot about gun violence now, but if you did that when I was a kid, there's a good chance you were going to get some rock salt shot at you. So I don't know why. I don't know why people think that it was common for people to walk into houses back then, because I don't ever remember that happening, and it had to have been way worse, with the older generations than my generation. But now you walk into somebody's house. Why would you walk into somebody's house? I don't. I agree with you. That doesn't make any sense to me. But again, the whole time you're sitting there going, God, these guys are idiots. Oh, okay, I'm not invested. I think if they don't develop characters, if they don't spend the time to develop characters, then you do make the bad guy the hero. And I don't know if they're intentionally doing that or what, but half the time, like I said, I'm like, yeah, they deserved it. Oh well, I don't care.
Yeah, well, especially with horror movies, they're notoriously so short that a lot of the time they'll just be like, well, we have to get the setup and then the kills and then the ending. So, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that's like an hour and 23 minutes, which is insanely short, especially for a horror movie. It's very short. So you can kind of tell that once it starts going, there's a little bit of backstory, but you can tell they weren't trying to build like a lore or a franchise, which a lot of these movies do. They were just setting up, like, why are these characters here? Why are they at this house? And then why are they going to get killed? Which, it works for that first movie, but then obviously they tried extending it beyond that, and they add more and more, and you're like, well, it really wasn't meant to carry such a weight because it was just meant to get to the action. So, which is why I think a lot of the new movies don't do very well, because there is no foundation for them. They weren't meant to become iconic, I suppose. But then you take them and you try to add to them and you try to do all these things, you get kind of this weird thing where you're paying homage to the original thing, but the original thing didn't really have much for you to work with at all, so now these other movies are really bad. So it's a very weird split.
Yeah, you have to do something different. And I know a lot of people don't like comedy in their horror movies, but I like some comedy in the horror movies. So, all the Nightmare on Elm Street movies were funny to me. I mean, Freddy just kept getting funnier and funnier. And I don't mind that so much.
Do get funnier. But
a lot of people don't like that in their horror movies. But I think that's just another way to do something different. And I think you have to do something different. For example, if you look at, and I don't know how many of I've seen because they all just kind of run together in my mind, but the original Saw movie was a good twist. I mean, there was actually good character development. It was scary, it was trippy, it was gory, but they also built, you had this enemy in your head the whole time, but then in the end you find out that you should have had empathy for that person at the end. So that's how they twisted it. But again, as that movie franchise kept going, people were rooting for the bad guy. Whereas throughout the whole movie, and not until the end did you kind of go, oh, okay, I see why he did that. But from then on, you're like, oh, well, he's picking these people because they're pieces of crap and they wronged him in some way.
Right. Yeah, they make him a lot more sympathetic, even to the point now where he's getting his own movies based on his backstory and why he does what he does, which if you take those movies out of context, you're like, why are all these people rooting for this man randomly snatching people off the street and killing them? So Hollywood's taken a really weird turn where, I don't know, it's just you look at all these movies and you're like, they're good movies, and it's really cool to see these icons be displayed in a really good way and still get good movies. But then you're also wondering, why are they focusing more on, like, Pennywise is the main marketing tool for the It movies and the whole It franchise. Everything revolves around Pennywise, but he's not the main character of the story.
No.
So it's just interesting to see this shift to where, because there are, like the main character of Scream, Sydney, she's the hero throughout the entire thing, and that doesn't really change. There's not really any sympathy for the Ghostface characters, whoever takes up the mantle per movie, which I think is a good example of them staying true to keeping the central character the hero. But that's I wouldn't say that's very common anymore.
No. It doesn't seem like it.
Right.
What do you think, just for annoyance-wise, what do you think are your biggest annoyances with the horror movies?
Jump scares. Jump scares are my biggest annoyance, probably, just because it is the easiest way to scare someone. And a lot of the time I'll be able to pick them out, especially if I'm watching the movie in theaters, just because the way I watch movies is a little bit different. So I do so much studying of what the shots mean that, like you were saying earlier, if they cut to a different shot, you can almost certainly tell that something is coming. I'll do that, and I'll do it with plot-wise also. So I'll usually, a lot of the times in my head, depending on what movie I'm watching, I'll be able to dissect kind of what comes next, especially when the jump scares are coming, because those, the way they shoot those are so obvious that those are really annoying, because I'll sit there and I'll know they're coming, and sometimes they'll still get me because I'm sitting there watching, waiting for them, and it's still just as effective as if I didn't know. So that's definitely a pretty big annoyance, just because I can tell by the way they're shooting the film that it's coming.
Probably one of the best jump scares, and I would only say that because it's the only one that I really remember, so it must be a really good one, because I've had a bunch of them, obviously, and they're just like, whatever. But the really good one is in Pet Sematary with the cat. That one's really good.
Yes, that's a good one.
Because that scares him, but that wasn't what he should have been scared of. But it's a really good one. But that's a really good one. But yeah, in general, I think that my most annoying thing is, again, when you go back to Scream, when they're telling you about the rules, they're like, well, don't do this, you moron. That's one of my biggest annoyance, is that people never fight back. There's very few movies where you actually see them fight back, because I'm like, well, human nature would say you have two choices. It's either fight or flight. Why does everybody fly? Why does everybody run? I'm like, if somebody's going to be chasing me and I know they're chasing me, I'm like, oh, no. I'm going to lay in wait for them. I'm not going down.
Right.
I'm not going down like a freaking loser. And actually, this movie that I just watched, it was, like I said, the one that was shot in 18 days, and the kid directed it. He was like 22 years old. He didn't do a bad job. It was actually a pretty good movie. It's on Amazon, called Macomb County. That was pretty decent, but the characters, they actually fought back. A couple, one of them got taken by surprise, and he didn't. But three of them actually fought back, and I'm like, good, somebody actually finally stands their ground and kind of fights back. No, they didn't.
Right.
And that so rarely happens. And I'm like, but realistically, would you just panic and trip, fall? I mean, like, don't run. Everybody runs and they hurt their ankle and all this other crap. I'm like, well, that's what drives me nuts. And that drives me nuts in the poor character development, when they do stuff that you're like, well, you deserve to get your, walk into somebody's house. What are you walking into somebody's house for? They can legally shoot you. I'm like, well, they could have legally shot you for walking in their house. I'm bludgeoning you and then cutting you to pieces. You can't really get away with that, but.
No. Yeah, I don't know. That's one of those things where I always watch the movies and I'm like, why would you run? But I can't remember what it was. There was something that happened that something like genuinely terrified me, and I caught myself running. I was like, okay, I kind of understand that. So I'm less critical of that part now, because in the movies it looks very stupid, because you're sitting there, you're watching it, you're like, there's a clear objective path that you can take down this killer and then it's over. But like, if something happens, I can't guarantee that I wouldn't do the exact same thing. But I think a movie that points it out very well is the original Scary Movie, where Ghostface is trying to get the main character, and she's like running up her stairs and she's like throwing all the items at him, and she like pushes her grandma down the stairs, and she's like pushing a piano and like all this stuff. I think that's a movie that makes fun of that joke pretty well. But yeah, that's one of those things where you're watching it, you're like, it's so easy to just do this and get it over with. But I can't guarantee that I wouldn't do the exact same thing. But it looks so funny when you see it on film.
Right. Well, and then you always outnumber the killer. I mean,
right.
It's a little bit different when, like with Texas Chainsaw, where there's all of them are nutbags. But like, if there's 5 of you and there's one killer, like, why are you running? If there's 2 of you, why are you running? I don't understand that. Like, there's 2 of you. You got a good chance of taking that person out.
Right.
What makes a good scary movie, though? It wouldn't be a scary movie. You wouldn't be telling that story, if they took that person out.
Because then it would just end.
Right. But when you're watching it, you can't help but just yell at them. You're like, oh, what are you doing? Just turn around.
Right.
I think that a lot of it has to do with, though, too, to make a good scary movie is not just the lighting and the camera shots and stuff like that. Is they have to have a good score. If they don't have some good music going.
Yes, that's another big thing is you listen to a lot of the scores for these new horror movies. It's a lot of the same thing movie to movie. But if you compare it like John Carpenter's score for Halloween, John Carpenter's score for Halloween is a big, iconic one that is always going to be associated with that movie. But, like, I can't... If you played me a soundtrack clip from the latest Conjuring movie, I wouldn't be able to tell that apart from anything else.
Right. I mean, it just has to be some music that builds some suspense. I mean, it doesn't have to be memorable, but it does have to be something that's, it can't sound like, rainbows and lollipops, but it does have to build suspense. And I'm sure musicians know what keys to play that are I'm sure it's like mostly flats and crap like that, but I'm sure they know what should be played in order to cause anxiety in people.
Right, certain frequencies and all that.
Right. So yeah, the lighting, important, the music's important. And I guess picking the proper... For some reason, everybody's scared of rural America, so I guess that's got to be frightening. Probably the only one that doesn't take place in really, really rural America, I guess, would be like, Candyman did a good job of being like in the urban area, which did pretty well.
Yeah, I was with Candyman. It's really interesting. They actually went out and filmed it like in gang territory and had to pay off gangs, and I thought that was so hilarious. And then they offered the gang members to be extras, so when you see like the shots outside the buildings, like those are actual gang members that just signed the release to be in the movie, which I think is funny. Yeah, the first one I've not seen any of the other ones. I just saw the first one. It was pretty decent. Yeah, I've only seen the first one. But there's definitely a lot of... Horror movies are very hard to get right, but very easy to make, which is very interesting, because there are so many different formulae. It's just like any movie, like a comedy. A comedy has to be shot a certain way, which is usually very bland. Comedies, usually you can get away with shooting bland because the actors have such charisma, hopefully, that... Like, you watch an Adam Sandler movie... Adam Sandler if you watch his older movies, they're funny because you're focusing on him and the way he's acting and what he's doing with the other characters, that you don't really care how the movie looks. It's just
Right.
it's a normal sunlight day in this restaurant in this town that you don't really need to care how it looks because you're focused on how funny it is.
Right. They could
But-
shoot at night and you wouldn't know the difference.
Yeah, you wouldn't really care. But horror movies are one of those things where everything has to be very purposeful. Like when the movie Blair Witch, when everybody was like, I don't think that's gonna work, but the way they shot it and everything, but that ended up becoming like a big horror staple. Like, you have to do everything very intentionally, or there's a very high chance that it just won't work in general.
Yeah, it's actually pretty funny that a lot of people make fun of the Blair Witch Project and say that it's not scary. I'm like, well, I thought it was scary. I thought it was scary. I thought they
Right.
did a good job. And when I saw it in the theater, everybody in the theater was scared. So I'm like, but they make fun of that movie. And I think they make fun of that movie is because their idea for marketing was like, well, we're going to say this was like based on a true story or or whatever.
Yeah.
Because they always want to do these goofy things. I'm like, well, nobody's going to believe that in the first place. But I think that's kind of how they shot themselves in the foot with that one. But filming wise, yeah, that was good because they made it look like these, they found this videotape of these, they found the camera or, the tape and
Right.
stuff. And I've never seen it, but which I think I should see it because I heard it's really scary. And same thing is when you go with a different formula, like, the Paranormal Activity, apparently did really well.
Yeah, those movies did really well. I've seen one of them. It's just their approach to horror is very different, but I also think that got dated very fast. But I think they're still good for what they are because they tried to be different. Like, they still are found footage movies, but I mean, just again, the way it's shot is so different because it's a lot like handheld cam or security footage. So I think they were different in a good way, even if the movie itself isn't that great.
Right.
Like, there's just a lot of different ways that people are trying to reinvent how movies are shot. Like, there was that movie that I really didn't want to see, that I still don't want to see, that takes place entirely on a laptop screen. And, like, watching the trailers for that movie where everything pretty much just takes place on these laptop screens. Like, I hate that concept, but that doesn't mean it's not gonna... I've heard a lot of praise for how those movies were done, though. So, even though the movies don't seem that they're that good, it's still interesting to see the way that they try and shoot these horror movies, or these movies in general, really differently.
Right. I don't know how these people spontaneously come up with these ideas, but I think a lot of it has to do with, I don't know if they're like consulting with, with like eye doctors and psychologists and neurologists and stuff like that, because you could take a lot of these that are the same movies. You could take the exact same movie and shoot it a different way and it wouldn't be scary. So
Right.
part of it is like, what does this trigger in our, adrenal system that makes us get scared or makes us anxious? And that's, like you said, it's how they shoot it. Or like, if you had a movie that's taking place on a laptop screen, who wants to look at that? That causes anxiety in the first place.
Yeah, I think the way that it's just because it's different, whatever is different is going to freak people out. So it's interesting to see them try and freak people out in the way that they make the movies is different as well. But that's a big part of it because there are very notorious ways to shoot different movies, like rom-com movies, or romance movies, filmed very similar to comedies where the style of filming doesn't matter. It's the actors and the story that matter. But horror movies is one of those distinct ones where your story has to matter, your characters have to matter, and then the way you shoot it is very, very important. Because like I was saying earlier, you shoot somebody close up, in that frame, you make them feel isolated. There's like a lot of small emotions that you can make people feel just with what they're seeing on a screen that they'll go home, they don't even think about why they felt that way, they just felt that way.
Yeah, and I think that because they have to keep figuring out you can't slip back into the slasher thing. You can pretty much still stick with, but it's going to be very hard for anybody to do anything like, like a werewolf movie or a vampire movie, or those things are not going to be considered scary because it's not part of our everyday life where anybody's going to be scared of it. Once you've got the advent of science in it, you have to actually pick stuff that's going to be scary to us, like a stalker on your internet, or somebody being able to watch you through the camera on your phone, or, something, even just like what you said, where you work, where you're able to actually zoom in on somebody in the store. So those are things that would actually be scary now because it's all part of our everyday life. That's why even when you can't good luck doing a zombie movie that's scary. And that's kind of like where Zombieland is smart, because they're like, well, it's a comedy, because we're not scared of zombies. It's just not something that scares us anymore. It's so commonplace now. They're like, oh, it's in The Walking Dead, the zombies are not the scary part of the show.
Yeah, they were at first, but now they've pivoted to where it's a character study just with zombies.
Yeah. It's just it's an annoyance. It's this perpetual annoyance.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of things that I think have fallen by the wayside, like zombies is one, because when George Romero's like Day of the Dead movies were first coming out, like those popularized zombies and kind of created them into the way that they are now. But those movies terrifying people back then in like the 60s is a lot different than people every Sunday tuning in to watch The Walking Dead because they enjoy the show. So it's interesting to see how the changes affect everything.
Right, and now when you look at it, probably the most impressive thing when you look at those movies, for me anyway, is the detail that they go into with making the zombies, how good the makeup artists are. Because they're not CGIing those. That would be so astronomically expensive. They're spending their money on, putting people through 3 hours of makeup to make it. To me, that's the cool part when you look at the zombies now. You're like, wow, if you look at 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and where they're at now, that's really cool.
Yeah, they always create new ways to do specific stuff. And like you look at The Walking Dead, every few seasons they like reinvent a certain type of zombie or the way that this zombie looks. Like a big one they were touting was season 2, when there's like that zombie that gets stuck in the well that splits in half. Like that was a really big deal because that was mostly practical. There was a little CGI in it, but like they're still coming up with new ways to make these zombies and make how they look and all their deformities and everything, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah, and clearly they're using their heads because, like if you're stuck in water, that body's going to swell and you could touch it and really it could burst like a balloon of flesh. So they're actually using their heads when they're consulting with people about these things, or researching it, which is nice to see.
Right.
So, top scary movie of all time for you. What do you think it is?
Well, if it's a movie that I would say I have a few. If it's a movie that actually scares me, the last movie I went to see that actually scared me was Jordan Peele's movie Us. That one was it was kind of a slasher, but it had a lot of psychological elements in it to where you're wondering why this is all happening, what's going on, why is all this going down. So that one, at least for this year, is probably the one that scared me the most. But John Carpenter's Halloween is probably my favorite horror movie of all time, just with the amount of how I think it's a really good movie, but it's also looking at it from like how it was made. It's also a movie that is very nice and inspiring to see because he had this idea. He didn't have a lot of money and he didn't have a lot of time, and then it became just an iconic movie. And I think that's pretty important as to why it's my favorite one.
Okay. So would you say that's your scariest one, or is it just your favorite one, or is it both?
I'd say It's my favorite one. It is scary. Depending on the circumstances I'll watch it in. Like, I can throw it on and it's not scary, but if I'm watching it, like the first time I watched it, I watched it for the first time last year and I thought it was actually scary because the way that the whole soundtrack comes together and the way that Michael Myers is portrayed and kind of how he's like a ghostly figure, I think that's actually scary. But I think for the last movie that actually terrified me, that would have to be Us or Hereditary. Those are two that actually really scared me.
Okay, well, I haven't seen Us, but I laughed during Hereditary.
Yeah, Hereditary is one of those ones where it's both a mixture of old and new horror. So it's like both campy but not campy. It's a very weird movie where if you watch it, if like 5 people watch it, they'll probably all have 5 different interpretations of what it was.
I wanted them all to die.
Yeah. Yep. But that was a good one for me.
There is, I'll have to find it for you because I can't remember what it's called, but there's a movie that Michael Keaton made a long time ago, and I'll have to find it for you. That one's a pretty good psychological one. I can't remember what it's called.
Okay.
But I'll have to find it for you. My favorite, the movie that still I think is the scariest movie. Well, there's 2 of them. Well, not 2 of them. There's more than 2 of them. There's one that I've never even seen because I refuse to see it, but I can still remember the previews for it when I was a kid, so I've never seen it and I've refused to see it. Someday I'll have to make myself see it. So I am scared by a movie I've never even seen, and it's called Magic.
Right.
And it's about this ventriloquist dummy. The other one is When a Stranger Calls. I've never seen it, but I've heard the whole thing as a child because I told my mom I wanted to watch it, and I just closed my eyes through the whole thing, curled up in a ball on the floor while she watched it. That one I'm pretty sure I could watch. I know the premise of that one, and it's a pretty good movie. And I think they remade it, but I'd rather see the original. But my most favorite one that I think is still scary, it's not my favorite movie, but it's the scariest one I still think is The Shining. I still think The Shining is the scariest one, because that one, even though we're still perplexed at the end by seeing him in the picture, and we're like, what really happened? Because we still don't know what the hell happened, and maybe Dr. Sleep will, I don't know, maybe that'll help.
Yeah, because you don't know what's real.
Right, you don't know what's real and what's not real, so is there a supernatural element to it, or was it all in their minds, or whatever, just because of their time being isolated?
Yeah.
But that's my scariest one. But my favorite movie of all time, even though it's funny, it's still considered a horror movie, is Army of Darkness. That's my favorite one.
That's the only one from the trilogy that I still haven't seen.
It's pretty dang funny. It's a good laugh. But I like that series in general. I mean, I love the first 2 also, but that one, the third one's my favorite because it's just so funny.
Right. Yeah. The second one is added on my list of top ones of all time. It's not necessary. The second one is like a good middle between the first one being more horror and the third one being a comedy. The second one kind of is like in the middle because it's a little scary, but it's still a little campy.
Right, but I think why that one's so great, that series is so great, is because you're so invested in Ash.
Right.
You don't want him.
Yeah.
You don't want him to succumb you don't want him to get killed. You want him to be the hero. You know, you root for him the whole time.
Yeah, I'd agree. So I definitely have to watch the third one. I just haven't. I'll have to see if it's available anywhere. I haven't seen it up yet.
Well, hopefully they're selling the 3-packs, or hopefully they're selling that one. I'm pretty sure I saw that one out for sale at Walmart. And no, we do not endorse Walmart. But, you know, if any Walmart people want to listen and they want to advertise on our podcast, that'd be so awesome. I'm sure that's not going to happen.
Right.
Well, good. I think we pretty much covered it.
Yeah.
All right. Did you want to give a plug for your music that's coming out and music that you've done, et cetera, et cetera?
So, just in under 2 weeks on Thursday, November 14th, my friends and I that I met down here, we've made a song together, and it's called Crazy. So that'll be coming out Thursday, November 14th at 9 p.m. And you can listen to any of my music just by going on to virtually any platform you listen to music on and just typing in my name, Skylar Beavers. Or if you type it in on Google, it'll actually have a Google result that displays all my music on the page, and it'll show you all my links and everything. So that's all pretty much the easiest way to listen to all that. And then the song that's coming out November 14th is probably one of the better things that my friends and I have written while we've been down here, so we're excited to put it out.
Great. Yeah. So I'm excited to hear it as always, as I like to be your biggest fan. And of course, Skylar does the intro and outro tracks for Beaveman and the Doc and for Beaveman and the Daughter. Same track, but he does that also. All right. Well, then from me here in Renegade Beaver Studios in beautiful Michigan, it is I, the Beaveman, saying adios, mooch fuckos.
All right. Have a good one.
Pika pika.